Picture this. You're standing in a sun-drenched clearing on a small island lost somewhere in a shallow prehistoric sea 66 million years ago. The air is warm, the grass is rustling gently, and for a moment everything feels calm. Then, without warning, the light around you begins to dim, not because a cloud has drifted overhead, but because something enormous has entered the airspace directly above you. There is no screech, no warning cry, only a heavy, leathery snap as massive wings flare at the last possible second. The ground shudders beneath 500 pounds of muscle and bone slamming down only yards away. In an instant, the graceful glider of the sky has folded itself into something else entirely. A 16-foot-tall predator on stilt-like legs, staring you down with a 10-foot skull built like a battering ram. This is not a scene from science fiction. This is a real moment that played out again and again on a lost island now buried beneath the soil of modern Romania, and the animal responsible for it would go on to shatter everything scientists thought they understood about the limits of flight. For over 50 years, the story of prehistoric skies had one undisputed champion, one name whispered with total authority in every museum hall and paleontology classroom on Earth. That reign was about to come to a violent, bone-crushing end, and the true king had been buried in Transylvanian rock the entire time, waiting. To understand how completely this discovery upended the science of flight, you first have to understand the giant it replaced. When the remains of Quetzalcoatlus northropi were first unearthed in Big Bend National Park, Texas in the 1970s, the discovery didn't just set a new record for the largest flying animal of all time. It fundamentally redefined what scientists believed biological life was capable of achieving. Before this find, our understanding of aerial giants was limited to creatures that, while impressive, operated within relatively modest boundaries. Quetzalcoatlus shattered those boundaries instantly. Standing on the ground, this creature reached roughly 18 feet tall, about the height of a fully grown giraffe. Its wingspan has been estimated at somewhere between 33 and 36 feet, roughly the wingspan of a small private airplane. This was not merely a large flying reptile, it was a living, breathing aircraft. Proof that nature could somehow hurl a 500-pound animal into open sky and keep it there. For decades, the scientific community treated this as the absolute ceiling. The consensus was firm: push a flying animal any larger, any heavier, and gravity simply wins. Bones would shatter under landing stress. Muscles would never generate the torque required to launch that much mass skyward. Quetzalcoatlus was, by every measure available, the final word on the subject. But history rarely closes its book so neatly. It is written in fragments, and many of its most important pages remain buried under tons of rock, waiting for the right excavation to bring them to light. While researchers were focused on the deserts of North America, marveling at the elegance and height of this feathered giant, something far darker, far heavier, and far more brutal was waiting to be uncovered on the other side of the planet. Scientists were so captivated by the sheer height and grace of Quetzalcoatlus that almost nobody thought to ask whether nature might have also produced something built less like a glider and more like an armored tank. The assumption was that 36 feet marked the absolute edge of what flight could support. Then, deep in the heart of what is now Romania, in a region known as the Hațeg Basin, the Earth began surrendering secrets nobody had expected. Archaeologists digging there weren't merely hoping to find another large flyer. They were about to uncover a creature that, by every rule known at the time, should not have been able to exist at all. The king of the American deserts was about to meet the nightmare of Transylvania, and the encounter would not simply add a few extra inches to a wingspan record. It would expose a level of raw predatory brutality that the skies of Earth had never produced before or since. To grasp how something this massive could ever leave the ground, you need to appreciate just how extreme the physics of flight truly are. Modern birds operate under a fairly forgiving set of rules. They are light, they are structurally delicate, and they rely on a simple two-legged launch to get airborne. But once you are dealing with an animal weighing as much as a high-performance motorcycle, those rules collapse entirely. If a 500-pound reptile attempted to leap into the air using only its hind legs, the force alone would likely shatter its own skeleton on takeoff. Gravity does not negotiate, and at this scale, it becomes a constant, unforgiving adversary. This tension fueled a genuine debate among researchers for years. How could an animal the size of a giraffe possibly achieve powered flight? Some argued these creatures were essentially oversized gliders, hurling themselves from cliffs and hoping to catch a rising thermal. Others suggested they barely left the ground at all, functioning more as massive scavengers than true flyers. The breakthrough came with the discovery of quadrupedal launch, a mechanism that changed the entire conversation. These titans were not birds in any meaningful sense. They were biological catapults. They would lean forward, load enormous tension into their chest and wing muscles using all four limbs, and then explode upward in one violent, synchronized motion, transitioning from a lumbering ground-bound walker into a master of open air within a matter of seconds. Even with this remarkable launch mechanism, there remains a hard structural ceiling. Every biological frame has a breaking point where an animal's weight simply overwhelms what its wings can physically support. The skeletons of most pterosaurs are marvels of lightweight engineering, hollow, air-filled, and impossibly thin to keep overall mass as low as possible. This is precisely why Quetzalcoatlus was treated as the theoretical limit for so long. Its entire anatomy was built around efficiency, a long-distance traveler engineered to soar effortlessly over the vast plains of Cretaceous North America with minimal energy expenditure. The Romanian fossils shattered that entire framework. The bones recovered from the Hațeg Basin were not paper-thin at all. They were thick, dense, and reinforced, clearly built to withstand punishing amounts of stress and torque that would snap the skeleton of any ordinary pterosaur instantly. This was an animal that appeared to simply ignore the weight ceiling that had defined flight for millions of years. It wasn't merely built to fly, it was built to absorb the kind of violent physical impact that would have destroyed the bones of virtually any other aerial creature on the planet. Why would evolution ever favor this kind of heavily armored design over the sleek efficiency that worked so well elsewhere? To answer that, we need to look at what happens when a flying animal stops being a passive scavenger and instead becomes an active, dominant predator, built specifically to collide with its prey at speed and walk away completely unscathed. Before descending fully into the mystery of the Romanian giant, it helps to understand the world it was born into. The Cretaceous skies were anything but peaceful. They were a crowded, lethal battlefield occupied by an entire armada of specialized predators, each one carved by evolution to dominate a very specific niche. Consider Pteranodon first, probably the most recognizable name in this story, though the real animal was far more formidable than pop culture suggests. With a wingspan near 20 feet and a long, bony crest crowning its skull, Pteranodon functioned as a high-speed ocean scout, patrolling coastlines with ruthless efficiency and diving into the surf at speeds close to 30 miles per hour, striking with enough force to impale fish well beneath the surface. Then there were the outliers, creatures that look almost like concept art from a science fiction film. Nyctosaurus may be the strangest of them all, sporting a bizarre L-shaped head crest, standing nearly 3 feet tall, dwarfing the rest of its comparatively modest body. Researchers still debate whether this structure functioned as a rudder, a sail to catch passing winds, or simply an elaborate display meant to intimidate rivals or attract mates. Whatever its function, it demonstrates just how experimental evolution was willing to get in the race to dominate prehistoric air. Moving inland, the specialization only intensifies. Azhdarchids like Alanka favored marshlands and dense forest, and while fully capable of flight with a wingspan around 10 feet, they spent much of their time grounded, stalking on all 4 limbs like an enormous leathery heron, using a long, spear-like beak to hunt through reeds and shallow water for anything small enough to swallow whole. Rather than hunting fish across the open sea, Alanka hunted baby dinosaurs directly in the undergrowth, an unsettling reversal of the usual predator-prey dynamic. And then there was Tupendictylus, arguably the showman of this entire cast, its skull dominated by an enormous vividly colored crest that almost certainly served as a warning to any creature considering a confrontation. In a world this dangerous, being highly visible was a luxury reserved only for the animals confident enough, or dangerous enough, to survive the attention. Every one of these creatures represented a genuine evolutionary triumph. They had conquered open ocean, dense forest, and coastal shoreline. Yet for all their success, they shared one common trait. They were relatively lightweight, highly specialized, and generally avoided direct physical confrontation with large prey. They were predators, certainly, but not true apex predators, capable of entering a physical fight and winning outright. That balance of power was about to be permanently broken by a flyer on a small, forgotten island that decided the open sky simply wasn't enough anymore. To understand exactly why the rules of nature were rewritten on this particular island, we need to examine the very specific conditions that made such a monster not just possible, but almost inevitable. 66 million years ago, the map of the world looked nothing like it does now. Europe was not the solid continental landmass we recognize today. It was instead a scattered archipelago of tropical islands. One of these, located in what is now modern Romania, was a place called Hațeg. This was far more than a random patch of land. It functioned as an evolutionary pressure cooker, a place where the standard rules of biology were quietly discarded in favor of something considerably stranger. Elsewhere on the planet, this was very much the age of giants, a period when long-necked sauropod dinosaurs routinely grew to the size of multi-story buildings. But on an isolated island, space is a luxury and food is a strictly finite resource. When a population of enormous animals becomes trapped on a landmass like this over millions of years, nature is forced to innovate in the opposite direction entirely. The result is a genuine, well-documented phenomenon known as insular dwarfism. Imagine an entire world where giants gradually began to shrink. Sauropods that should have reached 80 feet in length were instead forced to adapt to Hatzeg's limited vegetation, and over countless generations, they became progressively smaller, until fully mature, adult individuals stood no larger than a modern pony. These were the Megalodon, dwarf long-necked dinosaurs, so reduced in size that a mainland sauropod could have walked directly over one without lowering its head. On this island, the titans of the Cretaceous had become miniatures of themselves. This dramatic shrinking process, however, created an enormous power vacuum. On the open plains of North America or Asia, apex predators like Tyrannosaurus rex enforced a brutal but stable balance, keeping herbivore populations in check. On Hațeg Island, there were no giant ground predators of comparable scale. There were no massive land-based carnivores capable of hunting the newly dwarfed sauropods. For millions of years, the throne of apex predator sat completely empty. And an ecological vacuum like this is almost never left unfilled for long. If a predator cannot rise from the ground itself, evolution tends to find another way to fill that gap. The dwarf dinosaurs of Hațeg spent their days grazing across what must have felt like a genuine paradise, seemingly insulated from the terrors that stalked the mainland. They had little reason to watch the tree line nervously, and even less reason to expect danger from above. They were, in every practical sense, the undisputed masters of their small, isolated world. But they made one critical mistake. They forgot to look up. While the land dwellers on Hațeg were shrinking to survive on limited food, an entirely different group of animals was doing the exact opposite, growing larger, stronger, and increasingly violent, quietly preparing to exploit an opportunity nobody on the ground saw coming. The empty throne of Hațeg Island was about to be claimed, not by anything crawling through the underbrush, but by a creature descending from the open sky, one that had no interest in the polite rules of flight. It cared only about the abundance of easy, undefended prey wandering below it. The discovery of this true island king did not happen in one dramatic moment. There was no pristine, fully articulated skeleton lying conveniently in the dirt like something out of a movie. Instead, researchers were confronted with a confusing puzzle of broken fragments that, at first, made almost no sense to the people pulling them from the ground. When archaeologists began extracting remains from the Hațeg Basin, they weren't even initially certain they were looking at a flying animal at all. The bones were simply too robust, too dense, resembling the reinforced limbs of a heavy ground-dwelling carnivore rather than anything built for flight. In the world of prehistoric aviators, bones are typically among the most fragile structures ever preserved. To stay light enough for sustained flight, most pterosaurs evolved skeletons that were paper-thin and almost entirely hollow, which usually meant their remains were crushed flat under the sheer weight of accumulated sediment over millions of years. But the fragments emerging from Romanian soil told a different story entirely. These bones were sturdy, dense, and reinforced with internal struts that resembled structural support beams more than the delicate architecture of a typical wing. As more fragments were carefully excavated, the mystery only deepened. Researchers eventually uncovered a jaw fragment of genuinely staggering proportions. When properly measured, the implications were almost hard to believe. A skull nearly 10 feet in length. For perspective, that is a skull larger than a king-size mattress. Had this animal been standing in a modern backyard, it could have looked directly through a second-story window without needing to stretch upward at all. Skepticism within the field was understandable and immediate. Some researchers argued these might not be the remains of a flying animal at all, suggesting instead that they had stumbled upon an entirely new species of ground-dwelling dinosaur with unusually strange proportions. But as neck vertebrae and the distinctive joint structures of a wing were gradually uncovered and pieced together, the truth became impossible to deny. This was, without question, a pterosaur, a genuinely enormous flying reptile, yet one that appeared to have ignored virtually every rule of aerodynamic efficiency that kept Quetzalcoatlus aloft. The discovery sent shockwaves through the paleontological community. For decades, the field had operated on the assumption that the Texas giant represented the absolute ceiling of what nature could achieve in the sky. These Romanian fossils told a radically different story, describing an animal that had traded the streamlined efficiency of a glider for something closer to the structural integrity of a tank. It was as though evolution had taken the standard blueprint for a flying reptile and deliberately tested how much raw armor and muscle it could cram into the frame before gravity finally, inevitably, rebelled. This wasn't simply a new species waiting to be cataloged. It represented an entirely new category of predator. Researchers slowly came to realize they weren't looking at just another animal that happened to occupy the sky above Hațeg. They were looking directly at the creature that had filled the island's long-standing ecological vacuum. The feathered giant of the Americas finally had a genuine rival, and this rival had absolutely no interest in gracefully soaring over open plains. It had been built for something far more violent and far more direct. When the full reconstruction was finally completed, it revealed an animal that, by every conventional standard, shouldn't have been capable of flight at all. And yet, it clearly managed it. Scientists named the creature Hatzegopteryx, and to understand precisely why it dethroned the reigning giants of the Americas, you have to look past its wingspan and focus, instead, on its sheer mass and structural brutality. While Quetzalcoatlus was engineered like a high-performance glider, Hatzegopteryx was built like a piece of heavy artillery. Its most shocking anatomical feature was the neck. In most large pterosaurs, the neck is long, comparatively thin, and functions almost like a crane, designed for precise, delicate movements when picking up small prey. The neck of Hatzegopteryx was an entirely different creature altogether. It was noticeably shorter, dramatically broader, and reinforced with a complex internal network of bony struts. These structures weren't there for simple support. They were specifically engineered to absorb massive amounts of shock. Researchers estimate this creature possessed a neck roughly 3 times wider than its long-distance cousins back in Texas. This was, unmistakably, a neck built for direct combat. That single anatomical detail tells us almost everything we need to know about how this animal actually lived and hunted. A thin, delicate neck is a serious liability in any kind of physical confrontation, easily snapped or twisted under stress. A heavily reinforced neck, however, opens up an entirely different style of predation altogether. It meant Hatzegopteryx could drive its 10-foot beak into heavy, resisting prey with something approaching the force of a sledgehammer strike. It could violently thrash its head side to side to dismember a struggling target, or even engage directly with a dinosaur on the ground and reasonably expect to win that confrontation outright. Then there's the skull itself, which wasn't merely long but exceptionally wide and remarkably sturdy. Most flying reptiles evolved skulls that are largely hollow and constructed from thin bone, specifically to minimize weight at the front of the body, where excess mass creates the most aerodynamic difficulty. In Hatzegopteryx, evolution clearly prioritized heavy-duty armor over the weight savings seen in virtually every other flying species on record. The skull became rigid, dense, and powerful, capable of generating a bite force that would have seemed genuinely unthinkable for any other aerial animal in Earth's history. Even the wings themselves were adapted for raw power rather than speed or endurance. They were thick, densely muscled, and capable of producing the tremendous lift required to get this literal flying tank off the ground in the first place. Standing on solid Earth, this animal bore no resemblance whatsoever to a fragile, delicate bird. It looked instead like a 16-foot wall of solid muscle and leather, an armored predator that happened to also be capable of powered flight. This entire anatomical package was a direct evolutionary response to the unique conditions of Hațeg Island. In a world where the local dinosaur population had shrunk to become small and comparatively vulnerable, Hatzegopteryx had no real need to be an elegant, efficient glider. It didn't need to cross thousands of miles of open ocean in search of food. What it needed to be, above everything else, was the island's ultimate executioner. It stands as powerful evidence that given enough time and a sufficiently reliable food supply, evolution will eventually break nearly every established rule of physics simply to secure and defend a position at the very top of the food chain. To witness Hatzegopteryx in action is essentially to witness a nightmare given physical form. Across most of the prehistoric world, open sky represented safety, a reliable escape route for smaller, vulnerable animals fleeing ground-based threats. On this particular island, the sky itself became the single greatest source of danger imaginable. Picture standing in a sunlit forest clearing, warmth on your back, hearing nothing but the gentle rustle of wind moving through vegetation. Then the light begins to dim, not from any passing cloud, but because something has entered the airspace directly overhead. A young Megalosaurus wouldn't look up until it was already far too late. Hatzegopteryx didn't approach its prey with the gentle swoop typical of a hawk or eagle. It dropped like a falling stone, announced only by a terrifying, leathery snapping sound as its enormous wings flared open at the last conceivable second before impact. It slammed into the earth with such force that the ground didn't simply vibrate, it visibly shuddered under roughly 500 pounds of concentrated muscle and bone. In that single moment, the flying predator effectively vanished, replaced instantly by a 16-foot-tall ground stalker. It folded its massive wings into stilt-like walking limbs towering directly over a suddenly panicked herd of small dwarf dinosaurs. There was nothing clumsy or bird-like about its movement. Every stride carried the deliberate, focused momentum of a true apex predator locking onto a target. It singles out one animal, a young, pony-sized, long-necked dinosaur struggling desperately to find any available cover. Then the strike comes. Because of that heavily reinforced, ironclad neck, Hatzegopteryx doesn't need to hesitate or exercise caution. It drives its 10-foot skull forward with the raw speed of a mechanical piston. The beak doesn't simply bite down, it impales its target outright. The sheer force of that impact is enough to instantly snap bone and collapse lungs in a single devastating motion. And the attack doesn't stop there. Using those enormous, specialized neck muscles, the predator thrashes its prey violently from side to side, using its considerable mass to completely overwhelm any remaining struggle. Within mere seconds, it is entirely over. The winged tank stands motionless above its kill, releasing a low, guttural roar that seems to vibrate through the very soil of the island itself. It stands, without question or challenge, as the undisputed king of a world that, by every conventional rule of biology, should never have existed in the first place. It proved conclusively that the open sky was fully capable of producing a predator every bit as terrifying as anything that ever walked the surface of the Earth. For decades, the scientific consensus held firmly that Quetzalcoatlus represented the absolute limit of prehistoric flight, the final word on the subject. Hatzegopteryx demonstrates, quite dramatically, that researchers had only scratched the surface of what remains buried in the ground, with countless additional secrets almost certainly still waiting patiently to be uncovered. And Hatzegopteryx was hardly operating in isolation as one of history's most extreme biological outliers. Around the same broad window of prehistoric time, other creatures were independently pushing the boundaries of size and raw power to almost equally staggering extremes. Consider Argentinosaurus, a colossal herbivorous dinosaur that roamed what is now Argentina roughly 90 million years ago, widely regarded as one of the largest land animals to have ever existed, with length estimates reaching approximately 100 feet and weight estimates approaching 100 tons. Its neck alone accounted for roughly half its total body length, anchored to a surprisingly small skull housing a brain not much larger than a baseball. The species likely needed to consume close to half a ton of vegetation daily just to sustain a body of that scale, and its sheer size almost certainly left it with remarkably few natural predators willing to risk a confrontation. Sharing the late Cretaceous landscape was Spinosaurus, a genuinely massive theropod dinosaur recognized instantly by the elongated sail-like structure running along its spine. Fossils were originally discovered in Egypt during the early 20th century, though tragically destroyed during World War II, with newer specimens uncovered in recent decades revealing an animal that was apparently semi-aquatic, spending significant time hunting in and around water using a long, narrow snout ideally suited for catching fish. Some estimates place Spinosaurus at over 15 meters in length and around 8 metric tons, making it one of the largest carnivorous dinosaurs ever documented, regardless of exactly how much time it actually spent submerged. In the oceans of the late Triassic, roughly 210 million years ago, Shastasaurus patrolled the seas as one of the largest marine reptiles ever recorded, with some individuals reaching lengths around 20 meters, comparable to a modern blue whale, using an elongated paddle-equipped body built for sustained, efficient swimming. Millions of years later, the oceans produced another apex predator entirely, Megalodon, the enormous prehistoric shark that dominated marine ecosystems from roughly 23 million to as recently as 3.6 million years ago. The largest specimens are estimated to have reached around 18 meters in length and 60 tons in weight, dwarfing even the largest modern great white shark. It possessed a bite force estimated between 10 and 18 tons of pressure, more than 10 times stronger than any great white ever recorded. Its eventual extinction remains genuinely debated among researchers, though declining prey availability and rising competition from other emerging predators are frequently cited as likely contributing factors. This includes a possible rival named Leviathan, an enormous predatory sperm whale from roughly 12 to 13 million years ago, equipped with teeth reaching up to 36 centimeters in length. On land, Prehistoric stood as one of the largest terrestrial mammals ever documented, a hornless rhinoceros relative from the Oligocene epoch weighing up to 18 metric tons. Later predators like Diodon and the genuinely bizarre Megalania, a giant monitor lizard from Pleistocene Australia capable of climbing trees despite weighing up to 680 kilograms, filled their own violent ecological niches. And today, the title of largest animal ever to exist belongs decisively to the blue whale, capable of reaching over 30 meters in length and 200 tons, its heart alone weighing as much as a small car. Proof that the story of biological extremes, whether soaring through prehistoric skies or gliding through modern oceans, remains one of the most genuinely astonishing chapters in the entire history of life on Earth.